Waller's Haven is designated as a man-made river, and it forms the main artery of a network of ditches and drains used to stop the Pevensey levels from flooding. In angling terms, historically, it's always been viewed as a very good pike fishery in the winter and a very good bream fishery throughout the summer months. It's not a venue that I fish very often, and bream aren't a species that I fish for very often, but when I do, I tend to bring out the more modern tackle that I own, carbon rods and fixed spool reels. In many ways the sharpest of tackle for the dullest of fish. The approach for today was use a method feeder with some scalded pellet, stewed wheat and a small pellet hook bait. I'd already introduced probably around half a dozen balls of a similar ground bait. Because this is largely featureless, and if you don't happen to drop on top of a shoal of bream, then you do want to be able to stop them should they come past. Now, through luck or good judgment, I happened to stop in the right place, which isn't always that easy to do because every corner, every swim, every part looks equally as good, and you imagine would hold just as many fish, but it's not always the case, and it's very easy to be 10 yards away from where you need to be and catch nothing at all. But this first fish certainly gave me some confidence, and is a good example of the stamp of bream that the Wallers is well known for. And having caught one, I knew there was a reasonable chance of catching another, because just like sheep, they tend to move along the bottom grazing, and if you can keep enough bait in front of them, you'll keep them in the swim and hopefully pick them off one by one. But it's not just bream, there are carp and tench, as well as roach, rudd and perch. And sometimes the action can actually be quite hectic, and this second fish really did pull back, and for a moment I thought I'd possibly hooked a tench or even a carp, but as it came up to the surface I saw it was another bream, and unfortunately the hook pulled. But it did leave me wondering just how big that was. It wasn't huge, but I think it may have been bigger than the first. But bream can be deceptive, because if you hook them side on, their flat bodies act a lot like a drogue, and they have quite a lot of resistance in the water until they turn and face you, at which point typically they capitulate and flop and flap their way to the net. But I was keen to get back out there and see if I could catch another, because as I say, a lot of this fishing depends on being in the right place, on maximising the potential. There had been a club match on this stretch a couple of weeks previous to my visit, and all of the anglers had caught within a few ounces of each other, with the exception of one angler who'd caught 4 times the weight of anyone else, and clearly that angler had dropped on top of the bream and fished well enough to catch 40 odd pounds worth of them. Now I'm not in that class, but I'm not terrible either. And one of the things that did surprise me is that the bites were really twitchy. Just tremors rather than pulling the tip round. But I was managing to hit a few of them. And you can see just how readily bream give up. Once they know that the battle's lost. But over the course of a morning, I actually put together a reasonable bag of fish. All much of a muchness in terms of size. And it was ultimately a very enjoyable morning. If there's one negative of fishing out on the Pevensey levels, it is the wind. It starts off out in the English Channel, and regardless of where you are, it ends up in your face. And because of that, I hadn't filmed as much of the session as I'd hoped. But the swans were returning, and if anything, they'd increased in number. And I had things to do, non-fishing things to attend to. So I was away, but a couple of days later, I had an impromptu evening session on a tributary of the River Rother, because I'd been taking a walk and I'd seen a number of chub hanging around in a pool, and I couldn't resist, so I rushed home, grabbed a rod, a net, some prawns left over from a perch session and a couple of slices of bread, and made my way back down there. And I haven't really fished the river much this year, partly because I didn't want to pressure the fish too much with such low flow rates, and partly because the banks are precarious, and getting down there without spooking the fish is easier said than done. Now, unlike out on the levels, where I'd fed quite heavily to try and hold the fish in an area, with these small pools the fish are already there, and the trick is to feed one freebie at a time and look to create a competitive feeding situation. These fish are incredibly cute. They know when they're being fished for, but if you can build up their confidence and their enthusiasm so they just grab at any passing bait, you do stand a chance of catching one or two. And again, I was using a fixed spool reel, not quite as modern as the one that I used for the Bream, and I'm sure that there will be a number of anglers that will recognise the clunks and the clicks from this old piece of kit. And I started off with just a bit of bread flake squeezed around the hook and a self-cocking float that's ideal for just tripping the bait along the bottom in these pools. And I thought that I'd start at the head of the pool. The main pool is actually round the corner, but I thought if I could nab a fish quickly in this slightly faster water, then it shouldn't spook the fish that were slightly further back, or at least that was the hope. And sure enough, after the third or fourth trot down, the float disappeared and I was playing a chub. But you're not just playing a chub in these small rivers, you're playing the foliage and your footing and everything else. It's all a bit of a balancing act. But everything held firm. And I had this rather nice chub, which seemed like really quite a good fish for not a very big bit of river. And with that I decided to clamber back up, and this is the old Mitchell 300 paired with a £5 second-hand shop special solid fiberglass rod that I picked up, I don't know, 10-15 years ago. As I say, I'm sure that the clunking of a Mitchell 300, or this is a Mitchell match, will be familiar to many anglers of a certain age. And even now it must remain as one of the best-selling reels of all time. But having paused to put my coat back on, I clambered down the other side of the spine into the main area of the pool, and I could still see some fish, but they tucked themselves right under the cover on the far bank. So it was another case of just steadily feeding, introducing a mixture of bread and prawn sections, and giving them probably 20 minutes, 20-25 minutes to gain in confidence before it was worth casting out. By now I'd changed to a bit of prawn, but the fish were tucked right up under that overhang on the far bank there, very reluctant to come out. They'd only take a bait if it stayed right in that line, which was quite difficult. So I kept feeding in an attempt to bring them out into more open water, and eventually I saw the float twitch and struck into my second chub of the evening, and you can see how quickly it went up underneath that far bank. It's properly undercut. Bigger than the first, but I'm not convinced that it was the biggest fish in the pool. And this one was probably slightly easier to land because I was in a slightly more open area. And the reason I use such a big net is because it's, in my experience, it's far easier to net a small fish with a big net than a big fish with a small net. But a lovely looking fish. And as I say, probably slightly bigger than the first. But the really interesting thing was, as I was returning it, I saw the unmistakable dark stripes of a perch moving through the pool. Now I love perch. And on this particular stretch, I haven't seen or caught a perch since the late 80s, and even back then that would have been maybe a fish of 2 or 3 ounces. They're not a common fish, so to see one that actually looked quite good got me quite excited. And initially I tried a whole prawn and although it flashed at it, it wasn't keen on taking it, so I trimmed the prawn down progressively smaller and smaller, and I could see it taking these tiny bits of prawn on the bottom, and then I was just trying to line up the float so that I could just drift the bait down to where I could see this perch feeding. And then the float dipped, but I actually saw the fish pick the bait up. And whilst I managed to stay quite composed when I'm playing chub, I'm all over the place when I hook a perch. Now, I do like to pretend that I don't have favourite species, but I have an incredibly soft spot for perch. I just find them fascinating and mesmerising, and especially when they're slightly bigger. And one of the very few targets I have in angling is to catch a 2-pound perch from the river. And whilst this clearly wasn't 2 pounds, it was still a very, very impressive fish. And his departure brought out all the minnows in celebration. But of course I was putting him back. But a magnificent looking perch. And as I say, the first one that I've seen in this stretch for well over 30 years, so as I packed up, my mind was spinning with ideas on how to target more if they're there, and if not, how to catch the bigger chub that were hanging out in the pool.